Hello, and welcome to Senior Code Review Buddy. My name is Chris, and today I'm going to talk about why I think you shouldn't have functions that mix returning values directly with returning values through callbacks. This idea was suggested to me by a friend who ran into code similar to one of today's examples while working on an open source project. My friend found this pattern made it fairly frustrating for them to try and do the work they needed to. And if you stick around to that example, I'll let you know which open source project it was, and I think you've probably heard of this project before. Thanks for the idea, Fabio. Now, most of the time when calling a function, if there is a value to return, it'll be returned right away, just as part of the flow. And if you're dealing with a single-threaded program, this is the main way to return a value. But once we start getting threads involved, a few more options open up, like having the function take a callback to return the results later. And these different options can help smooth out how a program operates. An IO-heavy function can be offloaded to another thread, only calling back to the main thread when it's done, instead of blocking the main thread the whole time. It can be harder to follow the flow of code when you've got multiple threads, but the speed gains can be huge. But you can have things get even more complicated if your functions sometimes return directly and sometimes use callbacks instead of just sticking with one. I've got two examples today showing how this could go wrong, and I'll share my suggestions for how to clean them up. All right, so for our first example, we've got some initialization code. We've got initialize here, which calls into initialize database, which either returns synchronously right away, true or false, or it will take some time and call into async initialization on another thread, which will wait some amount of time and then set the event to signal that it's completed. These functions aren't doing anything other than communicating with each other right now, just because it can be really complex already to work with threads. So I figured we would just focus on sort of the interactions between each other. So now when we look at initialize, it needs to sort of handle the two cases I talked about. We could either have value set right away, or we could get the event telling us that we need to sort of wait on this event to know if it's initialized. So if we get event, we've got the little code here that we'll handle, and we'll just wait for 2 seconds, and if the event is triggered in 2 seconds, we'll assume value equals true and everything is good. If it doesn't, we're actually just going to assume that the database has failed to initialize. We don't, in this flow, communicate if there was a failure. If you actually look at the code, it's going to wait for 5 seconds, so there aren't real failures here. It's just it took too long, but we'll just assume the way this is written, that's kind of what happens. And yeah, then here we've got the value. Yeah, the initialize is completed, or it wasn't. And I have added a few tests below here that I can run just to make sure that things work and that, yeah, they're all good, and that if I make any changes, that things still work as expected. Now, in the real world, we probably wouldn't have this code waiting on the event right after. We'd probably run some other code first, but I've left it here since there isn't other code to run and it makes our function easier to understand. But I think we can agree that overall the result here is complicated. Like, all we're doing is trying to initialize the database, and this is a fair amount of code just to figure out if it was initialized or not. So how can we improve this? And can we improve it in such a way that we could have other code, inserted here between starting the initialized database and actually blocking for the result? I think we can, and I think the first step to make things clear is to stop returning 2 items. Callers should just be given a single value to worry about, so let's create a new class, initialization state. We'll go up, and to create initialization state, so we'll start by taking what state could be, and we'll also take an optional queue that we'll call queue. That's how we'll communicate across the threads instead of just waiting on an event. So oops. Okay, Oh, and then we need to import queue. We'll then have two functions. Let's say get state, which will return the current value of the state, and wait for state, which will block until we get the state and then return it. Let's start by writing wait for state first. All right, so for wait for state, we will want a timeout in case people don't want to wait. And so if we have a queue and our state hasn't been set yet, oops, is none, we will try fetching state from the queue and setting it to the state. So queue get timeout. And we'll also want to catch if the queue is empty, because that just means we still want to keep waiting. This is normal. Yeah, just return. Because maybe we called it with a 2-second timeout and just wasn't ready yet. And then, as I mentioned, we return our state. And yeah, that's all we need here. It may still be none at that point or not. Okay, and now that we've got wait for state done, we'll do get state, which actually is going to be quite easy, because we're going to be a little sneaky. We're actually just going to call wait for state, but we'll set timeout to none, because then it's not going to block anymore. So it will do the fetching of the queue if anything is in it, but it will return right away. Oh, I misspelled that. So this way, we're only sort of writing this function, and this one kind of benefits from it for free. All right, so now that we've got initialization state done, let's update initialize database to use it. So the two synchronous cases are easy. We just pass in the state. We don't have to worry about setting a queue because there is no other thread that is not needed. Okay, and then, yeah, down here, we are going to use a queue, as I'd mentioned, instead of an event. So we get rid of that. We pass in the queue. Add this thing there. And then instead of returning this, we want it to be the initialization state where the current state is none. And then we pass in the queue. And then we just have to update this to do queue.put. And we'll only return true because we'll assume this kind of always works if it happens. Yeah, so now initialize database is good. Now that we've completed initialize database to return the initialization state, let's update initialize to work with that. So instead of returning two values, we just return state, and then we will just say value equals state dot wait for state, and we'll still have it wait 2 seconds since that's what we did before. And we don't need any of this code then. And that's it. And we run. We make sure that everything still works. Yeah, got expected. Well, yeah, so it's all good. So I think this is much cleaner than before, and by returning this initialized state, callers have a much simpler interface to deal with. If we wanted to add new code, it's really easy to add stuff in here before we query state. So yeah, there's only sort of limited stuff we have to worry about. Okay, with that done, let's jump over to the second example. So this example is a bit more complicated. We've got a function query database that can do one of three things when we call it. It can return a value right away. This could be viewed as sort of finding a value in a cache. It can return a value later by calling a callback. This can be viewed as, it's not in the cache, so you have to do a slow database query. Or in the third case, you query the database, don't find the value, and you don't actually call the callback, so you don't tell the user. And as I said before, I'll run them again, but I do have some tests. Yep, some tests for this one to make sure that if anything breaks, as I mess around with it, I find out. So I'll start off by saying that I really don't like this third case, because as the caller of this function, if the callback hasn't been called, I don't know if it's because I haven't waited long enough or because it's not going to get called back. And there's no way to figure that out, and it makes it a lot trickier to work with this function. Now, this wasn't something I came up with on my own either. This was the sort of situation that my friend found himself in when they were working on the open source Chromium project. Yep, Chromium, which is used to develop the Chrome browser, the Edge browser, and a bunch of other browsers, I think. So despite having all of these excellent engineers on this project, issues like this can still sneak in. No one is going to have perfect code all of the time. Now, did this enter this way because there was time pressure, someone new to the team, or did it just evolve over time? I don't know, but I think it's a reminder that bad code can kind of sneak in anywhere. So we won't worry about the Chromium example for now, but how can we fix the example here? Well, similar to last time, I think we should adjust the interface to only return in one way. We should get rid of returning directly here and return through the callback, so the callers only need to worry about getting the information through the callback. Another change that I'm going to make is I'm going to actually return something here. I want users to know that, okay, the callback has been called. I don't need to wait any longer. It is done. So we'll start by handling the synchronous case. None start, so we won't return directly. Instead, we will have an else. So if we don't hit that exception above, we'll do create a thread, which we'll call the callback with the value. And we return none because we don't need to continue anymore. So let's make sure everything still passes for that. Yep, they all still passed. That's good. And now we'll clean up the other section, which is just doing callback none here. Now, I will point out that one of the challenges with using the queue here is if these values could be none, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between we didn't find anything versus we found something and it's none. But at least for this test case I've got here, I'm assuming that the valid values to find are only integers, so we won't worry about that. So that's all we need, and this function is updated. Can run, make sure everything is still good. Yep, and then when we go down here, we actually can get rid of result now because we're never returning directly. So just want to set results down here and run again and make sure it's all good. Yep, so we've got this. I think it's cleaner than before. Now this example was a bit easier to clean up than our first example. It also was a lot easier than the Chromium example since I have seen that. So how did my friend approach cleaning up that Chromium example? They did what I consider to be one of the hardest things to do. They looked at it and decided it wasn't worth the effort of fixing. While the code was challenging for them to work with and really could use a cleanup, the value of cleaning it up just wasn't there. This code isn't expected to be modified often, so the time gained in faster future changes would be minimal. This code is also very important for Chromium, so if something accidentally broke during the cleanup and it wasn't caught by a test, the cost here could be very high. So after looking at the pros and the cons, it was decided that, at least for now, this was one issue that just wasn't worth fixing. Thanks for walking through that with me today. Hopefully, the next time you are working on a function that could either return a value directly or through a callback, you'll commit to just one path. I think the callers of that function will thank you, and that could even be you. And thanks again to Fabio for suggesting this great idea. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button below and subscribing. If you have any other comments, code you'd like me to review, or ideas you'd like me to talk about, please leave a comment below or reach me directly at chris@seniorcodereviewbuddy.com. Thanks, and have a great day.